you're gonna want to. Hey guys, welcome to part 2 of my series on how to diagnose and fix a KTM that's burning oil. So through this saga, the very quick backstory is it started burning oil a little while ago. I started noticing smoke in the exhaust. It's definitely burning a lot of oil at this point. I let it go kind of as long as I could. It's burning like a shitload of oil. In part 1 of this video, link in the description, I show you guys how to do a leak down test on the cylinder to try to figure out if the problem is indeed something with the piston or the valves. There's basically 2 ways oil can get into the piston or into the cylinder to burn in the ignition cycle. One's from the top and one's from the bottom. On top, it can leak down around the valve stems from oil that's up in the valve train area, and it will get into the intake pathway that way and burn with the firing. The second way from the bottom is it gets sucked up around the piston rings into the cylinder from underneath, and it will burn the same way. The diagnosis process is really similar. The solution is quite different. So what you're gonna wanna start with, because it's really easy to do, is a leak down test. And in part 1, I show you how to do that leak down test and how to understand or interpret the results. In this video, I'm gonna show you how to change the valve stem seals. So this video is the one you're gonna wanna watch if you did the leak down test and your engine holds compression. Leak down test is more complicated than just a compression test. Please watch that video. It's not very long and it'll really help you figure out how to do that right. Simple compression test won't work on these bikes because they have a decompression mechanism that leaks off compression to make it easier on the starter motor when the bike is starting. So you can't just crank it around and measure compression. If you're here in this video, it's because you've got bad valve stem seals, meaning your bike's burning oil, but your engine compression checks out, okay? If that's the case, this is the video for you. We're gonna show you how to pull the head and use a special tool to compress the springs and change the valve stems. It's a pretty cool process. It's not all that difficult, and I don't want you guys to be intimidated. I dove into it without really having done that before on this particular bike, and it really turned out not to be that hard at all. KTM has done a really nice job of making the bike accessible to work on. A lot of the stuff's really well engineered, and it's not hard to do at all. So recommend that you check out the first video, and then if your problem diagnosis to valve stem seals, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Okay, so I'm gonna move pretty fast through this part of the process. I've already prepped the bike, which means pull the plastics, pull the tank, drain the coolant. I'm not gonna drain the oil because that's gonna sit at like static oil levels down here, like when the bike's off. I've already loosened a lot of the bolts because I was doing the compression leak down testing before this. So we're gonna pull the valve cover, it's already loose. Then you're gonna lock the whole bike in TDC because we're gonna be moving the piston and things like that, and we need to be able to bring it back. We won't lock it in TDC until we're putting things back together. Because we're gonna take it out of alignment anyway. That's where we're gonna undo the timing. And so when we're putting things back together, what we'll do is bring the piston back to TDC, lock it there. And then when we put the cylinder back in place and like get up to the valve train, then we'll line the valve train up to it. And we know that the piston will be locked in place. So I'm gonna pull the valve train, pull the cam, sprocket, pull the cam, take the chain, like secure it, and then I'm just gonna work my way down, pull the head, and then attack the cylinder. So I'll show some clips here and there of some of the bits of the process, but I'm gonna dive right in now. Pull the valve cover by rocking it forward and then pivoting it out to the left. So, yeah, so there are 4 bolts that hold the cam in place. These 2 hold this bracket that lets you pull the cam sprocket out, and the back 2 let you pull the rods that hold the lifters. We need to remove all plugs like this one from the other side that connect to the head because we're going to be pulling the head. Already taken the coolant lines off. While you're in here working on the top stuff, it's a good idea to stuff a rag in here. You really don't want to drop components down into the bottom side of the engine because we're going to be going pretty far in, but we're hopefully not splitting the cases. And so we don't want to drop stuff down into the bottom if we can help it. So with the screws removed from this bracket, you can lift this bracket out. That. And this here is what actually holds the cam sprocket in place. So your cam is now free. With these 2 screws removed, you can pull out the rods that hold the valve lifters in place. You'll need to thread a screw into the ends of them. This screw is the one that holds the gas tank on the bike, so it's a perfect size. And you'll see these just pull out like this. There is a front and back to these, so keep them in the same order that you took them out from. There's also an outside end and an inside end. So the end that's inside is not threaded. The outside end is threaded. That's where we just pulled it from. You'll want that to be outside when you put them back in, or you'll have trouble getting them out in the future. There's also an up and a down when you put these back in. This like cutout spot for the screw head is what needs to go up. And with those rods out, you'll be able to lift the valve lifters out. And then you're gonna use a magnet, and we're gonna grab the valve shims from the top of the valve stack. It's these little guys. And you need to keep them in the same order that they come out from, because these are all different sizes. This is how you set your valve clearance, by changing the size of these, the thickness of these. So make sure that you know which exact valve the shim came off of, or you're gonna have to recheck and reset your valve clearances when you're done. Next, we're gonna remove tension on the cam chain by removing the cam chain tensioner, which is this little guy. You do that by first pulling the center bolt, which is gonna release the spring that's inside. You wanna make sure you don't lose the spring, so catch whatever comes out. So it comes out like this. You can see there's the bolt, there's a washer, and there's the spring. You can then remove the two bolts that hold the tensioner itself in place. And here's the tensioner. So it's got a gasket. It's a good idea to replace it. I've gotten away with not doing that in the past, but if you can get one, replace it. Here's how the tensioner works. That spring presses this little rod in against this chain guide, and that's what tensions the chain. To release that pressure, you press down on the little tab here, and you'll be able to slide that way back in. This is auto tightening, right? So that spring puts pressure on this rod, which presses it in as the chain wears and takes up slack until this is out of adjustment at the very end, at which point you have to change the cam chain. So there's talk about like how many clicks of adjustment you have left. This is what they're talking about. Now my cam sprocket will be loose, or the whole cam rather, and you can pull it out of the guides and tilt it down like this. And then you can drop the timing chain off the back of it like so. And then we're gonna pull the cam, the whole cam and sprocket out of the engine. But first I'm gonna grab some zip ties, and I'm gonna make like a carrier for the cam chain, and I'm gonna tie it up here so it doesn't drop to the bottom of the engine and disappear on me. And then I can really carefully remove the cam. So that will come out like that. This is your auto decompression mechanism, and your lobes, your sprocket, and this is where the one bearing runs, and this is where the other bearing runs. So you can kind of check out all those surfaces if you're worried about any of that. Next, we're gonna release the engine mounts from both sides. They both look exactly like this. So I'm just gonna loosen these screws. Actually, I'm gonna pull it off entirely, because I need to be able to wiggle the head around and the cylinder to lift them out, and I want those out of the way. I'll leave it hanging like that. Same thing on the other side. Then I need to remove the exhaust header from the head, and to do that I'm going to pop off the two springs that hold it in place here. There's no bolts, just these springs, and they're a little bit hard to get to, so good luck. You're then going to remove the head bolts, take them off in a crisscross pattern and a little at a time, like in 3 stages, so you don't warp the head. And then there's this little bolt, this little guy, that comes out from the front here that holds this section together. Once you've got them loose, you can just pull those bolts to get the head loose. There is a washer on each bolt, so make sure you get that. And I like to keep these bolts in the same order. There's at least a side difference between them, because some are inside the valve cover and all oily, and others are outside. I don't know if it makes much difference, but it doesn't hurt. With the head bolts free, I'm finally going to remove this rag because it's now in the way, and I'm going to gently pry off the intake boot with this big screwdriver, maybe once this thing's free. And we should be able to wiggle the head loose. Yep, it's loose. Now there are 2 dowel pins underneath right here. They really easily could fall. This channel goes like all the way down, and it's really easy to lose the dowel pins down into the engine if they happen to fall out. So I think what I'm going to do is try to get a rag in that channel. So the intake boot really does need to come off. It's being a pain in the butt. There we go. Okay, I can see one of the dowel pins, and the other one is up in the engine, or up in the head. That makes me more nervous. If it's sitting down in the cylinder, that's fine. When it's up in the head, it could fall. So I've got a finger on it, I'm gonna hold on to it. All right, it seems pretty set in there. The other thing I've got to do now is drop my cam chain out of the head and then re-secure it. I'm gonna add another zip tie and put it down here to the shift lever. Just don't want to drop it down in, you know. Dowel seems pretty secure, but it still makes me nervous. I am gonna stuff a rag in here, and then it's the intake boot that's binding. There we go. Once that pops, this thing's pretty easy to get out. Kind of finagle it out of the engine bay here, and there's your head. And so if you wanted to do like the valve stem seals, you could now easily use the valve stem seal tool and get on there. Okay, with the head removed from the bike, we can go ahead and get at the valve stem seals. This is the exhaust side. That's the exhaust header right there, or down, whatever, connector. This is the intake side. The intake valves have different sized stem seals than the exhaust valves. So I'm gonna do all four, but I'm just gonna show you how to do one because they're all the same process. So this is a valve spring compression tool. Actually, it's part of one, and there's the other part. That goes on like that. You can get these at a motorcycle store. They're super handy. Basically what you're gonna do is you're gonna set that pointy side against the bottom of the valve like that. And then we're gonna screw the top side down against the valve bucket like this. And then we're gonna crank down on it, put some pressure, and you're gonna see we're gonna remove the pressure from the little clip that holds everything in place. There are this like cone washer. They're magnetic, fortunately, so you can get one out, but they look like that. And you're gonna set those aside. Sometimes you may have to, because this is like putting pressure sideways on the valve stem. So I'm gonna push a little bit that way. You see I'm gonna free up that other cone. With those out of the way, I can remove the pressure from my spring tool. And I can set my spring tool aside for a second. Now I can remove the valve spring, and there's this bucket on top. That's where your valve shim is gonna sit for adjustment purposes. So I'm gonna set that aside. I would recommend doing one of these at a time. If you remove multiple of them and start mixing them up, I don't know what will happen. So we're gonna do one at a time. And then the valve stem seal is what sits right here. And you can pop it off with a screwdriver or a pair of pliers. You wanna be really careful not to screw up the valve stem though. This is the stem of the valve. If you push the valve, you can remove the valve, actually make it easier. So don't get those mixed up either. They need to go back in where they came from. Again, why you do one at a time. And then I'm just gonna grab this and pop it off, probably these pliers. There it is. And you can see when I remove it, there's bits of rubber left over, so probably these weren't sealing as well as they could have. So we're gonna throw that away and we're gonna replace it. I'm gonna check everything here. So there's a lip inside here and inside here, and those have to snap into place. So we'll just put the new one on like that. We'll gently, yeah, kind of feel it snap in. So we know that's in place. Then we're gonna slide the valve back up in there. Pops in. Great. Now I've got to put the valve spring back on. And then I gotta get my valve compression tool, my spring compression tool back in place. And then I'm gonna recompress the valve spring. You wanna make sure that the stem comes up through the bucket. You don't wanna just press against everything. And you only need to drop it low enough so there's I don't know if you can see it on camera, but there's a ring or like a slot in the top of the valve stem. That's where these little cone pieces are gonna go back. And I found that you can pretty easily drop them into place with a little pair of needle nose pliers. So I like to take them from the corner like that, and I'm just gonna set it in just like that. So it's just kind of sitting in there. They're gonna pop into place as we release the spring pressure. One on the back side, great. Now they're not quite in place, so I'm gonna really carefully start to back off. Yep, and as I do that, the bucket comes up. It's like also a cone shape. The bucket will come up and press those into place. And they ideally will lock in, yeah, they'll lock into that slot on top of the valve stem, and they'll prevent the whole thing from coming apart. And there's the new stem seal installed. Our valve is back in place, spring is back in place, everything's good to go. So you're gonna make your way around, do all four. Remember, the intake valves have a bigger valve stem seal. They're actually bigger valve stems than the exhaust valves, but do one at a time, work your way around. Once you're all done, we're gonna put the head back in the engine and we start to reverse the whole process. When you get your camshaft set to TDC, remove this screw, take off this ring and thread the screw back in, and you can tighten it up against the crank, I think, or something in there to hold everything in place. Of course, make sure that when you're putting everything back together at the end, that you make sure you put the washer back on and screw this back in and tighten it up snug, or you'll be leaking oil all over the place. If you forget to put the washer back in and screw it back in, you're gonna lock the engine, and when you try to go start it, you're gonna fuck stuff up. All right, we're gonna start reassembling everything here. We're gonna start with the head gasket. This screw is offset to this side to match up with this. I like to put these two shims into the bottom of the cylinder and not the head, because I don't want to have them fall off the head and fall into the engine gap here. In fact, I'm gonna put a rag in while I do this. It's worth being extremely careful, because it's a real pain in the ass if you drop stuff down into the engine. There we go. Rag out of the way. Now I'm gonna put the head gasket on those pins. Now I can safely bring my head into play. You wanna be careful you don't ding up your radiators too much. They're easy to mess up. Go, that's enough to pull the timing chain up through. Hang that up here this time. Then we're gonna finagle the head into place. The hardest part is the intake boot. There we go. The intake boot slipped on. It's set in place. You can now tighten down the head bolts. So I'm gonna thread them into place first. Again, put a rag in here. Really crappy to start over at this point. Drop all the bolts in, screw them hand tight. Tighten them in 3 stages in a cross pattern. So you're gonna go across, and 3 stages meaning hand tight, do like 20 foot-pounds, and then the full torque is like 39.5 or something. I'm just gonna do 40 foot-pounds. Then we can remove the rag, and we're gonna put in the bolt that goes down here, and that's only to like 10 foot-pounds or something. I'm not gonna torque wrench it. I have a pretty good sense for how it should feel. And then we're gonna start rebuilding the cam. So we're gonna slide the cam itself in. This needs to be done with the chain. The chain's gonna go around it. And then I'm gonna pop my zip ties out of the way. And then we're gonna lift the cam chain up on the cam sprocket so we can slide the cam all the way in. No, we actually have to pull it out a little bit so that it drops down, the cam drops down, and then we can get the chain on it. And this is where you're gonna start to set your timing. So there's a little divot mark in the surface of the cam sprocket. That's gonna need to go straight up. And there's a divot mark here in the base, and those two need to line up with each other. If you're gonna be a tooth off to the left, because the chain's gonna tension from this side and pull you probably about 1 tooth back. So I need to go 1 tooth more left. So now my mark lines up here to here, but when the cam chain tensions, yeah, it pulls right back to the center. It's never perfect, but you got to get it within a tooth of being off. Then we can install the cam chain tensioner, which is this doohickey, and I've got a new gasket for it. It can only go on one way. See if you got it backwards, like it doesn't line up. And the 2 screws that hold that in place. Snug these up, don't make them too tight. Then we're gonna put the spring that tensions the cam chain tensioner in place. We don't need to do anything, it auto sets. So this whole spring gets compressed into the hole, and then you screw the nut in. And tighten up that bolt. That's it, the chain will tension itself. Don't squeeze on these because you'll pre-tension it and it'll take care of itself. You make sure this is pressed in all the way, and then we're gonna start to put the top of everything back together. So put a rag back in here to avoid dropping parts down in the engine. You now need to replace the valve shims into the top of the buckets on the top of the valve springs. It's really important that those go back in the same order that you took them out, or the same locations that you took them out of. Then we can put the valve lifters in. This pin goes with the cutout side up and the threaded end out to the right. Push it in until the holes line up. Same thing on the exhaust side. Then we're going to replace this bracket that holds the cam sprocket in place, making sure that this edge gets down into the groove on the sprocket to hold everything in place. Then we're going to replace the 2 screws that hold the cam lock in place, and then the 2 screws that hold the lifter pins on the other side. And we'll snug them down. Now we're going to install the valve cover. I've put a new ring on here so it doesn't sit as cleanly in the cover as I would like it to. I mean, it'll seat, but what I mean is it's going to fall out while I'm installing it, which is going to be super annoying. So I'm going to try to hold on to it while I finagle this in place. That works, and then we're going to drop all the bolts in to tighten that in. There's also a little seal up in this inside here that I've changed. Now we're going to put these engine braces back on. These cables go behind, and then you just replace all the bolts we took out of them. So the larger bolt obviously goes back where it came from the bottom. Might be a good idea to Loctite these. I'm not going to right now. I'll do that later if everything works out. Snug those down, and same thing on the other side. Next, we're going to reinstall the exhaust header. Pretty easy, just like that, and then we'll put those springs in, including this long one from the other side. Don't forget to tighten the ring for the intake boot. Of course, make sure the intake boot is on all the way. In my case, it is. And then you'll reinstall the water hoses. Don't forget the clamps that go on them. Put the spark plug and wires back in. And from there, you can put the tank and everything back on and start it up and see if your oil leak is fixed. Before you start the engine, it's a good idea to turn it over by hand manually. The way I'm going to do that is rock it up on the kickstand, and I have the bike up in 5th or 6th gear, and I'm just going to turn the rear wheel around, and I'm going to do a couple of full rotations because I want to make sure that nothing interferes. I want to make sure my timing's off. If it's not, your valves will come down and hit the piston, and you'll fuck things up if you're trying to run it that way. So I'm going to do it gently, using the rear wheel to crank the engine. We're going to make sure that everything clears a couple of rounds before we try to start it or anything. Before you do anything, double check that lock screw for the crank on the other side of the engine has been reinstalled with the ring in place so that it's not locking anything. I've got a couple of thumps of the valves and nothing's hitting, so I think I'm okay. So that's how you change valve stem seals on a KTM 500. Should be really similar on any bike that's got similar components. Valve stem seals are pretty universal part. They may look a little different. The head's gonna be different, I don't know, but the process is roughly the same. If you diagnosed your bike following part 1 of this video, or of this series, which was how to do a leak down test on the cylinder, and your oil consumption diagnosed as a bad valve stem seals, then the process that we just showed you how to go through should take care of that for you. In my case, it unfortunately didn't. I did this totally out of order from what I'm recommending to you guys. I didn't start with a leak down test, so I wasted a ton of time actually, in my case, changing valve stem seals that weren't actually bad. I did the leak down test after the fact and figured out that it's probably something with the cylinder, and I'm gonna dive into that in part 3 of this video, which is if your leak down test fails because of something wrong with the piston. Part 3 is going to show you how to change the piston rings and inspect the various components that are down there. But that's it for now, guys. Hopefully your problem was just the valve stem seals, which we've just gone through how to repair or replace, whatever. Before I let you go, check out the line of helmet chin mounts we make for GoPros and other action cameras. They're custom designed for every helmet in our lineup. We've got 65 and growing number of helmets. They're awesome. Link in the description to our shop, check those out. And then of course, if you are still suffering from your bike burning oil like I am, you're gonna wanna go with me to part 3, which is where we dive into diagnosing getting oil sucked up from the bottom of the piston. So let's get over there.